Language of Creation Book Club. Good evening, everyone. We're with the Language of Creation Book Club. We're on week 5, part 5. This week we'll be going through chapters 23 onwards. We'll see how it goes, but we've prepared up to chapter 27. Although I know some of you have been reading further and are very excited to keep going, but that's what we're trying to stick to for this week. Personally, I found it quite difficult to prepare for this week. I didn't find lots of material in it. I don't know whether that's a sentiment that other people share. Maybe other people had tons to talk about, but I found this relatively difficult. So I kind of hope we have some high quality discussion that spirals off. So hopefully that happens. I think let's start this week, like other weeks, with an intention that we set for this book club, and then we'll each build on that within this. So my intention is to lead this book club in a productive way, and to gain more connection to real life patterns, and to take the patterns that are in this book and then be able to apply them more in real life. That's my intention. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, so thank you, Gustavs, by the way, for helping to facilitate this, since Manuel is not going to be able to join us, at least in the beginning. Maybe he'll hop in at the end. This particular section is really important, I think, because they're talking about, in chapter 24, authority and power, and then they're also talking about Adam's descendants as a microcosm. And so my intention is sort of to highlight some of these things, because these are sort of important topics to my channel, to Navigating Patterns in particular. But also I think in general, this is what people need to understand more about the world. I really intend to dig down deep in this and help to exemplify some of those important concepts, because Matthieu really has his finger on these things with respect to the biblical reference side, and my job is still more on the materialism side. So that's really my intent, to really approach it with how can we make those particular topics more clear for people to engage with.
Okay, all right, thank you. RJ, are you ready to share intentions? Okay, I guess not. Olena, would you like to go?
Yeah, I'll go. My intention is still to listen well and try to be conscious of the fact that my position is going to be a little bit different from others, and so I want to see if I can take that other position more quickly.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty strong position straight out the gate. Okay,
we'll see how I do.
We'll see how it goes. Yeah, we'll see how you do. Castle, how about you?
Might I go last? I'm gonna talk just a little bit.
You are last, actually, because Danny can't. Yeah.
I'm stable at the moment.
Okay,
likewise, I don't have much material. My intention is to gain an understanding of the book, but I didn't have much material over this section. I think if you accept where he's coming from, it's all pretty straightforward what he's saying. But if you don't accept where he's coming from, then I think you can kind of push back on it. But yeah, I'm just going to be doing a lot of listening, I think.
Okay. So since last week, so my original intention was that I wanted to do kind of, and Matthieu kind of lays this out in one of his excerpts, the sort of King Solomon thing, you acquire wisdom, and then with all that you have done, get understanding, which is, it sounds like that's your intention as well, Gustavs. And one of the things that I've been really trying to do is get that understanding this week. Just with everything that I've been doing, I've been ruminating a lot on this stuff, and I've been seeing a lot of parallels in the stuff that I've just been engaging with, like outside of this. So I have a lot of notes in a lot of different media that I'm going to be kind of presenting over this next little while. But I was also thinking on some of the things that we got snagged on last week. That we had kind of a little bit of a post-video conversation that was very brief. And then, but also throughout the actual book club last week, there was a few things that stuck out to me. And so those things I had as a particular intention kind of interiorly this week. And I did notice it was something that in a comment that kind of I went back and forth with Mark briefly this week about his Gerard video on navigating patterns. That gave me a lot of insight because we were struggling a lot with sort of the balance of the polarity between heaven and earth, and then kind of those associations as they pertain to masculine and feminine. And so I went deep into the etymology of some of those words, and I have some things to kind of present on there, hopefully, so we have some better tools to work with. But my ultimate intention this week, and something that I actually practiced on my mom a little bit because she has very little interest in a lot of these things, but I was able to get through in a way that that made sense and was actually interesting to her. So I'm hoping that for a lot of people who, because as Matthieu says, a lot of these concepts you need a lot of examples because they're not complicated; they're too simple to actually do. So you need to materialize them by orienting with a lot of different examples. And so my hope is to kind of present a lot of those scriptural, practical, those sorts of things, and from the tradition and things like that. So one of the things I wanted to mention, just with respect to sorry, I have a great deal of tabs here open. But one of the things we were kind of getting stuck on last week was the kind of idea of like primacy between like heaven and earth, like, oh, which one happened first or which one is more important or something like that. And it's difficult, and we're going to see a lot of stuff that I have diagrams for and that are in the book that kind of demonstrate this. But it's tough because everything heaven and earth wise emanated from above, so it's difficult to kind of see this. And it's also hard because in the creation narrative, you have to read it from one thing to another. Like you can't read both of the parts simultaneously. You have to start somewhere and end somewhere. So it's difficult to kind of get the idea of like the simultaneous like balance and unity between the two. So I just wanted to briefly go. I mean, I say briefly.
Oh, wait. Let's
Yeah.
stay on the intentions for the moment. So
Sure.
if you needed to distill your intention into like one short thing, like one short sentence, what would it be, Castle?
Yes, it'll be to
This week.
communicate my findings as best as I can within the time limit.
Okay, all right. Ray, can you? Ray needs one more second.
I can still share my intention, guys.
Okay, yeah, please do.
For the folks at home, being on Discord and on StreamYard and on the phone does not always work too hot. But yeah, my intention is once I've gotten my technical stuff sorted out to really try to continue to listen for other people's understandings, so I can try to maybe see where they are in the landscape, where I am in the landscape here. Also, as Cassie was just saying, keeping an eye towards the diagrams and trying to engage with them both in their own terms, but also I think what we can do as an opportunity being on this channel and this group is to also bring in some relatively outside stuff or even our own opinions. So I may indeed end up sharing some of my own thoughts and opinions today, but really thinking about some other people out there in the audience in future who've shared with me that they get a lot out of this particular book club, separate from what the book has to offer, and separate from other discussions in a different framing that I know that person with. So that's my intention, that's my attitude, and in a second you'll see my face as well.
Thank you. That's very nice. I think there'll be a lot of value in that. So before we transition into the real meat of the matter, I wanted to have I've one request, and that is that when you refer to parts of the book, you refer to chapters instead of pages, because we have different books and different editions, and the PDF is different. So if you refer to chapters, it'll be a bit more clear. I know that's a problem that we've had in previous weeks, so I hope that helps. But before we start, if you remember your intention, if you think about it, I have a couple of questions that I would like each of you to ask yourself, and not necessarily sure, but just ask yourself. So the first question is, how long did you prepare? How long did you spend preparing for this week's book club? Be honest with yourself. And then, is that in line with your intention? Does that align? Second question, how much material did you prepare? Do you think the amount of material is in line with your intention? Does it fit? How long will it take you to ask the questions that you want to ask and have them answered? How long will it take you to share the material that you've prepared? Do you think it's enough, or do you think it's too much? Is it in line with your intention? And do you think the quality of what you have prepared, do you think that is also in line with your intention? Because it might not be. And reflect on that. Maybe that'll give you some pause, and maybe it'll give you some encouragement. So I guess we can begin with that. I think maybe let's start by sharing the PDF, if we can do that. Yeah, all right, thank you. So this is chapter 23, where we're beginning, and this is an example chapter. We have a lot of example chapters, actually, which is, I think, the main reason why we don't have that much to talk about, because we're given an image, and then we're given an exposition of that image, and then just it's kind of an application. So it's already taken to its conclusion. But do any of you have something to share about this? So flipping through.
Yeah, who has notes for 23 or open
Yeah.
questions?
I have notes for everything, but I'd like everyone else to go first.
I can go first for this one. My biggest thing with this one was kind of just a bit of needed clarity on how he derived heaven and earth and deed and word from I am what I am. So if anybody has any comments on that, I would love to hear them, because I feel like when I read that, I'm kind of convincing myself that that can be found in there.
Let me see.
Well, so he says I am. So you're talking about the indeed that's in brackets. Is that the okay? But so in English, am is a statement of an action, actually, not a. I think that's where you're confused. Like I am, things don't exist outside of their action, right? And that's hard when we're told physics is the thing, right?
They do in the second I am, but he claims just the second is the word. It's the identity.
So the name Yahweh has no vowels in it. If you think about how do you pronounce a word with no vowels in it, it kind of sounds like breath.
I think it also means is. Like I think that was one of those things in I think Dennis Prager said that in the Exodus series, that he said that Yahweh technically means is. So it's kind of like an I am what I am, I will be what I will be, I am who am, and then is. Like just who are you is. Like the being, like the very source of being is kind of the answer that you're kind of getting back. But also it's so simple that it's, you know, it encapsulates everything else. So it's very subtle. Like it's hard to define something it's like looking straight up at the sun and being like, what is that? You know?
Yeah. I mean, actions happen on Earth, and so yeah, it's the verb to be problem, which is actually a problem because the verb to be is kind of overloaded in our language use. It's so ubiquitous we don't even see it, and I think an action by itself, like if you could isolate an action, it wouldn't be an action anymore. That's why he goes from deed to earth, right? Because spiritual actions aren't the same. You don't have the same ability to notice the spiritual actions you do with a material or earthly action. And I think if you just replace earth with material there, maybe that helps. What is pointing at a proposition, right? And so that's a word. and a word is a pointer, hopefully in this case, upward, especially with respect to being, because beings aren't, mere physical manifestations, right? There's a spiritual manifestation to being, and that I think is where we get wrapped up, right? Because they want the material, the physical thing, to be the thing, and then they don't want any non-material existences because it messes up their worldview. And John Vervaeke actually talks about this, right? He says, "Is E equals MC squared real? Well, where is it? Can I turn it around? If I give it to you, do you have it? Does it leave my hands? Like what? No, but it's real, right? And so you sort of have to extend your idea of reality into not the realm of pure thought, because that's a trap, but into the realm of words which point and connect the emanation and the emergence, roughly speaking, or heaven and earth."
And so it requires kind of like an apophatic orientation. Like, okay, Jordan Peterson talks about like construct validation in psychology, that it's just like, okay, we actually can't see this or touch it, but we can get a response. And we can tell like when it's not happening, and we can kind of compare and contrast that over much experimentation, kind of get a feel for like what is under this blanket, in a sense.
Another way to think about it too is to realize that when you make a statement, any statement, there's multiple ways you can look at that statement and not change the statement, but enhance it, not changed, right? It's sort of like the fact that anything has a theoretically endless description. Like you can just keep adding descriptors to any phenomena, whether it's physical or spiritual in the world. And so when he's, seemingly reinterpreting "I am what I am," all he's doing is showing you two different perspectives on the same word choice, because again, this is about connecting things. And so when you're connecting things, you have two possible guaranteed perspectives, right? The perspective of the thing on one side of the connection, the perspective of the thing on the other side of the connection, right? And that ordering matters, though, right? That's a different. The ordering matter is a different topic, but that's sort of what Castle hinted at earlier.
How
to
is the
Castle's
ordering
point, just to Castle's point, something that I'd like to use perhaps the Pageauian lexicon to reframe what Castle was saying. The time tense in the language for I will be with that which I will be, etc., is where the unity and the multiplicity are one. That's an important point, because as we move forward in some of these chapters, we will see some of the it's hard to get your mind around at first, but when you're seeing these different diagrams, it's pretty much the same thing from different perspectives, different points of view. In an earlier session, I used the metaphor of the x-axis for the horizontal, the flat world, the y-axis for the verticality. Some of these things we'll be seeing as the z-axis. And as we move forward, we'll actually be seeing things superimposed. We'll be seeing something that is a diagram of a y-axis thing being interpolated through an x-axis diagram, where sometimes one laid over the other. So thank you very much, Castle, for allowing me to make that point. And Gustavus, thank you for the space.
I think I actually prepared some diagrams that do exactly that kind of look at different perspectives. So I'm interested to see what you have to share, because maybe there'll be some conflict there. Who knows? Yeah, and just on this sort of no, you know what? Does anyone have anything completely different to share that we can discuss about this page or this chapter? Don't feel constrained to this page necessarily.
Well, Could I make just a few statements here about just kind of laying out a couple of those tools, as I kind of alluded to in the beginning? So it's just a couple of things that I think we got a little bit hung up on in the previous one. So I just want to kind of get those out of the way a little bit, or present a few things we can use. So one of the things that Matthieu he goes ahead and presents the earthly as feminine. And there was an interesting conversation that you, Gustavs, and I had with Manuel the last week a little bit, where he pointed out, and it clicked for me instantly, and it's going to come up here in this next chapter, actually, about the idea of the earthly power being feminine in relationship to the heavenly. So I wanted to go ahead and break down the word feminine just a little bit, because, and this was something that I was testing on my mom a little bit, because she was like, oh, kind of separating female from feminine is a little difficult, especially with the kind of the common usage. But one of the things I wanted to kind of share is that feminine's root, the Proto-Indo-European one, DHEI, is related to filial. It's related to nourishing and nurturing, and it's related to carrying and bearing, and having and being fruitful. So the thing that carries, that bears fruit. Sometimes the fruit with the seed in it, and let me see. I think there was another one that was in there, but yeah, it was mostly related to like nurturing and that type of thing. And I wanted to kind of demonstrate a little bit that when I go, and later on I'm going to be using some diagrams and stuff, so I drew some, I did some on my phone, I have some of these things. As I was going through my week processing this information, this wisdom that I had received from reading the book and everything, I was processing the information, gathering up materials to support these ideas that in many ways, and even they're colorful. I have the fruit with their seeds in them. I am actually demonstrating and acting in the feminine. It doesn't mean that I'm female, but I'm acting in the feminine. I'm acting in the feminine relationship to Gustavs and Mark, who are organizing this, who are also acting in the feminine relationship to Matthieu Pageau, the author, as we're doing these things. So these things kind of stacked up with the heads and bodies thing. And so I just wanted to kind of share that, because one of the things Manuel pointed out is that when you look at some of these pairings between brothers, mostly, that we're going to see that in the next chapter, but I won't go too deep into that yet. But the earthly one is also the feminine one. That doesn't mean that they are effeminate. So like Cain, for example, is feminine in relationship to Abel, the prototypical priest, even though Cain is the strong Og type guy. He's the one that bears fruit. He bears and carries. He builds the city. So we'll get into that a little bit more. But then also,
can I ask, when you said that you found the root for the feminine, like what is that root?
It's Proto-Indo-European DHE with like a flat line I, and it's D or day or something like that.
That sounds really similar to like Deus, like God, doesn't it?
It's a separate one. So it forms all or part of affiliate, affiliation, effeminate, epithelium, fawn, fecund, felicitate, feminine, fennel, fetus, filial, infelicity, like a lot of these words. So, but strangely, yeah, it sounds phonetically similar, but it's not etymologically, as far as I can tell.
How's it pronounced? Do you know?
I have no, I mean, it's Proto-Indo-European, so it's like DHEI. You can also look up just on, I think the app is called Etym Online, ETYM Online. Then it comes up with, you can look up feminine and then it'll have the root on there. So there's a lot of other examples that are kind of on there, but it comes up with that. And so I wanted to kind of give that tool, and then also with respect to the kind of above and below simultaneous unity, I wanted to break down the word equal really quick, because a lot of people use the word equal, and this is something that Mark has kind of talked about at length, but the etymology of the word equal means level, flat, and more or less like neutral. And so that's not the same thing. They are, I might formulate it as polar complementary halves, something like that. And that within that union, it's generative. So we'll kind of get into that in later chapters. Matthieu gives examples of the ideas meeting the paper and the ink on the paper, and that generates words. Like this pattern happens a lot, but it is, to your point, Elena, last week, it's necessary that it's simultaneous and that they're two halves, but that they're not equal in the sense of flat or identical, but they're necessary halves that have to be there in order for it to be generative. But you need to, the way that we read stuff, you have to say one thing at a time. And so just for the folks at home, if they're running into any problems there, I just wanted to present that.
Father Eric, reminder that Proto-Indo-European is scholarly conjecture.
Yeah.
Might be useful, might be bunk. Yeah, also true. I mean, a lot of people, when they're dealing with language and etymology going, we'll say too far back, like back before written words, the problem we run into is that a lot of people don't realize spelling has changed. The letters, so Latin's a classic example. There are no U's in Latin. They're all V's. Right? It's like, wait a minute. Right? It's not that they don't use the V. It's that the V does not sound the way you expect. That's not that far back. So to Father Eric's point, yeah, these things do not. If you're expecting some sort of weird linear progression out of language, that never happens. At least not for long. It happens across generations, like maybe handfuls of generations, but it doesn't. It doesn't actually work that way in practice over large spans of time, and especially not with the classic cultures and stuff. So yeah, it is definitely a change. Father Eric, they added J into Latin in 1978. Yeah, there's all kinds of things, and I believe if I'm remembering correctly from failing Latin several times, that Latin had a lot more sounds, but a lot of that was wrapped up in how the words were configured. And you may think that's silly until you find out about Hebrew, and then you're like, oh, Hebrew's insane. Yes, Hebrew is insane. That is true.
There's a level to the whole of like, well, what was the original spelling and what was the root word, and look at what these pictographs mean, to the point where, like, to Father's Eric's point, we don't talk about Bruno for a reason. If you guys catch the reference, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't exist. It just means we don't talk about him. It's one of those difficulties about being so far downstream. It's one of those Sauron's eye problems of the world.
Oh, we lost.
Oh.
I'm just going to start referring to that stuff as like the way back. I don't care what the actual. It just here's the word from the way back, and that's just what I'm going to kind of use.
I like it. Rocky and Bullwinkle style.
Excellent.
But to your Dennis Prager point, before we move on from chapter 23, the "Thou shalt not kill" line sounds very Prager-ish. Castle, do you have any thoughts?
Hang on. Let me
rephrase. I have seen Prager make a similar point, and therefore I'm saying it's Prager-ish. This is kind of one of those things where I'm not insulting Prager when I say this, but a broken clock is right twice a day, just about how he's putting it, and the fact that it links up here. Not to say that anyone's clock is broken or not. Who am I to judge?
What was Prager saying?
The "Thou shalt not kill," but are all murders equal? What if I kill my enemy, my parents, my child, my servant, my dog? What if I kill someone in an accident or in self-defense? So
Right.
on and so forth, which brings us into some of these very diagrams to Castle's point earlier.
I think type of stuff gets. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to add a little flavor here. I think because John Vervaeke makes this mistake too. They say no, murder and killing are the same, or I don't want to get into the argument of the difference, but there is the difference. That's why there's two words, guys, and it's a really important difference. And it's also important to your point.
To the not talking about Bruno thing. Weirdly, while there are two words that are used for it now, at a certain point in time, it was a contextual thing.
Well, right, but that's what I was
what
going to
I'm
say.
pointing out is that the word, if you're going to talk to someone who speaks Hebrew, they're going to say, no, this word means this both things, but contextually, it specifically is saying kill,
Right,
which
but
is what I just read from. Yeah.
the murder distinction, the reason why people don't make it or make it is strictly for legal purposes, right? And what are legal purposes? Legal purposes are punishment by the society or the culture or the state. That's what legal stuff is, right? It's to determine consequences. And so the flavor that doesn't come out when you just use one word like kill is the consequences can't be equal for all types of killing. Obviously not, right? Because you're giving sacrifices. So that's a form of killing. I don't know, right? So you run into these problems kind of immediately if you actually think about it. And that's why it's important that they're two different words, because killing is not a valenced act in the world, right? But it is an act in the world. And to your point, RJ, you need that flavor, that understanding that there are differences, which is what he goes into immediately. There are differences. You can't just say killing and all killing is, or all killing should result in. That doesn't make any sense.
I'm front running a little bit, but just to see if Castle's familiar with something. Castle, you're familiar with the term cut flower ethics?
No.
Okay, it seems like Mark is. But we're talking about the earth and the feminine and everything else. Like I said, it's a bit of a front run and a punt, but we can come back to it. Maybe we can come back to it.
Yeah, let's see if it comes up. Hopefully it won't, because whatever. But we'll see. It probably will, but we'll see.
I didn't bring up Prager. He's just already on the table.
Do we fair? Do we have any questions on the diagrams? Because I feel like that's people seem to be struggling with I've said this before. The book, the words, yeah, do away with them. It's really all about the diagrams. I mean, obviously the words help. That's why they're there. But like the diagrams are really the key to understanding the point.
Well, later on, I underlined that Pageau specifically says that he's using the language and words as an analog.
Right. Yeah, I would call it a scaffold or a framework, right? As well as an analog. Yeah. Gustav, do you want to put up the diagram page for me, and we'll?
Sure. Yeah. Let's try. I think. Is this the diagram you're thinking of?
Yeah. Yeah. Does everybody sort of understand that?
Could I say, so this diagram, as far as kind of referencing the bit about the thou shalt not kill, and then it kind of turned into multiplicity of all these different implications and stuff, is also one of the reasons why the book of Leviticus is so exhausting to read, is because they're just covering a huge amount of implications. But it's interesting because this diagram and the kind of materializing of the questions being raised up and then the answers being lowered and everything, for me, is simultaneously a diagram of the implications of thou shalt not kill, then materializing into all of the other tiny little implications, and also the judicial system of starting with Moses, of starting out with Moses as the one little white dot, and then you need the different tiers of the separate judges, because even with Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all these books of law that cover all of the implications and stuff, you still need a ton of different judges at various different levels to still figure out the other intricacies that they didn't cover in the text and everything. So, but I see this this diagram as kind of an analogy for both of those at the same time.
What point are you trying to make, RJ, with that?
Hold on. Here, RJ, try again. Yeah. Oh yeah,
I wanted to actually juxtapose exactly what was being said to the earlier diagram from, I guess this is just right before chapter 12, so that would make it chapter 11. To the point about the levels and scale, but also in that part of Leviticus, and it's connected to the events of Exodus. You have the Moses disseminating his authority of decision making in a way that Mark was saying about legality, to the heads of other people. And then it specifically says, and it's actually referenced in the book, and the small matters came before them, and which implies, at least for this text, that the larger matters go to Moses. I mean, he does say, see the actual, excuse me, sorry about that, guys. It does say, see the actual rest of the story where that is said.
Right.
But if we could throw back the diagram from the current chapter we're in, and then we look at the middle diagram and the right hand diagram. This, as I understand it, and I certainly don't claim to understand it very much at all, is moving from the left just as a starting place, and this is actually kind of a linear thing here. We've got answers and questions, and then we've got the middle piece, which now we've got layers, and then we're actually kind of in where it's on the right hand side. We're now seeing the same thing on the left at a different actual level of verticality, and that is in part why I brought up the earlier diagram.
Yeah.
Does
No,
anybody have any questions about that?
No, that's a good. I just want to add a little bit of flavor. One way to look at this is to notice that the parts on the bottom, which are parts of undetermined type, that's why they're question marks, get traded for structure or order at the top. Right? That's another way to sort of think about what's going on in the diagram. And that's why RJ showed what he showed, right? To show you that there is this component, this higher lower component, that this is representing from a different perspective.
And I would
and I also want to point out that the number of questions at the bottom decreases, but I suspect it doesn't ever go to 0.
Right.
Yeah, there's a remainder that stays there, yeah. But the questions are answered by the initial one, and then it's answered in layers as it goes down. Could I show I have a little thing here. There is RJ's kind of point that he had on there. Let me see if I can get this angled up. So I put these two little pyramids together. So these are kind of representations of, we have the U.S. judicial system kind of laid out here. And then you also have, I put a pyramid there with the descending materiality of King Nebuchadnezzar's statue in his dream. So you start with gold, and then you have silver, brass or bronze, and then you have steel or iron, and then you have iron and clay. So as you descend there, it becomes more corporeal, less flexible, and there's less opacity, I guess you could say, or it reflects less light. So it becomes more common, but with greater body, or it becomes more precious, or more reflective of light, but also rarer. And so that's going to kind of come up. That's all I got for that one. But
and more refined, Castle. More refined.
Yes.
Right. Well, yeah. The gold doesn't look like that coming out of the ground.
Right. Exactly. And so that's also what we're seeing is the refinement process in that previous diagram. Is you're kind of seeing, okay, you have the abstract idea, or maybe you have the one kind of piece that everything is going to kind of assemble underneath, and then everything else is getting refined up through the structure as it receives meaning, and then now you have a body that you can work with. So that's simultaneously, that pyramid. It's also a representation of a functioning judicial system, and then in the case of King Nebuchadnezzar, that's also a representation of like a man with a conical robe, kind of standing. You've got the stable feet and everything, and then as you kind of go up, you get lighter and more kind of reflecting light. If that's using your eyes or your speech or whatever else, it becomes closer to air as you get higher up.
Reflecting light. All right, is it pretty good on the diagram? I mean, because I think actually that these transitional diagrams, because I do want to give full credit to RJ for this. Like these transitional diagrams and the fact that they're from different perspectives is super important to understanding all the connectedness within the diagrams. Right.
There's one thing I actually want to point out that I didn't see get pointed out that I think is salient, perhaps relevant. To borrow the word choice in lexicon from Peterson, where we see question marks here, to me, I see this as simply below a level of resolution that can be seen.
Yeah.
That's he sometimes will talk about this in Tohu Vavohu and Tiamat. That's not a horrible way of accessing what I'm saying. Where we see question marks is just not known, but not known in the sense of it's too far away up, it's just too far away down. Maybe you would need a microscope. That
That's
kind
the
of
that's the telescope microscope problem for sure.
right.
And that it's not yet either not ready to be integrated yet, or just people haven't answered that enigma yet. And I think I don't know where he does it, or if he just did it on Twitter or something, but Matthieu has talked about kind of the Hebrew words of good and bad, because he insists on not good and evil, but specifically good and bad. And that's another one of those kind of like contextual Hebrew things. But that you have these kind of things where it's tov is good, and which is kind of like that which aligns with the principles, because you can have something that's just like, oh, this is good, but I don't need this right now. Like if I have a wrench, but I'm trying to eat, it's like, okay, that's not tov. But then you have ra, which is interesting because ra, R-A, is not, even though it's, those are English letters, but it's not actually, as far as I can tell, at least not in the etymology stuff, connected to like the R-A-W word in English, but you can apply some of that meaning. So it's, if you have like raw meat, like, yeah, it's not tov to eat, but also that doesn't mean that you can't ever eat it. It just needs to undergo a refinement process.
Right. Well, and some things can't ever be integrated. Like we've got to, right. There has to be a remainder. The fact that the remainder is not something to be fixed or purified,
This
which
is a
might
bit
be
of a deep
relevant
cut.
to today, right?
This is going to be a bit of a deep cut, but to actually cite exactly the kind of thinking or that it exists in real life, there's something called, and I'm translating badly, the hamminess of the soup rule. You're not allowed to have ham, but there is a rule about how much ham you can have in the soup. It's a very long, complicated conversation that I don't have the authority or competency to have. It does exist. You can Google it. It's a good time.
That's a Jewish tradition?
No, it's technically a rule. Yeah,
Like,
I
from
think
where?
it's in the Talmud.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it's called Shem Sheshu. I'm not gonna try to say it, but yeah, it's like the 60th of the ham rule, or sorry, 60th of the soup rule, where for this thing that you're not allowed to have ever, according to this one rule, well, here's another rule that says exactly how much of it you're allowed to have, and if there's more than this point, then it actually breaks the rule of not at all, which is like a little bit mind breaking, but it shows you that the question and the frame very much matters.
I'm immediately getting the images of like the what is it called, the zitzit, the fringes on the edge of the Jewish garments.
Oh, the tzitzit,
yeah, that it's specifically supposed to be the material that you're actually not supposed to make or mix the garments with, but you keep it on the outside, right on the edges. It's like the ham in this case is like the gargoyle of the soup.
And because you bring up tzitzit, and because it's in the book, in a way, there is the blue thread that is supposed to be on the tzitzit, where Matthieu picks up on that with the blue of the curtains, but that's I think in not the next chapter, which maybe we should move along a little bit. Well,
I want to make sure everybody's okay with the diagram and the rest of the chapter, so we can at least make one chapter in 43 minutes. That'd be great.
Yeah. Let's start moving on. So, yeah, please.
So this answering of questions at the bottom and then putting them into that structure, would that be thought of in a way as the white circle inside the dark part of the yin and yang symbol? Because
yes. The short answer is absolutely. This is why I get upset with people who say we need to merge East and West are the same. You can't merge them. They're already identical. The fact that your perspective is not the Eastern cultural perspective does not mean it's not the same. It means that you can't, and I mean this technically, and it is a technical point, Nesbitt, geography of thought, right? You can't understand it correctly the way they do, ever. but you can't understand this. Like, that's all. And it just makes life easier when you realize that certain symbols are just never going to work for you because you grew up in a culture. That's all. It's not hard.
Could I offer a Western one? It might be just the seed inside the fruit, or like the fruit bearing its seed. Or it's just like that's also kind of like a material example, sort of. Like, I'm not trying to reconcile East and West, but I'm just saying, like,
Well,
for a
or
Western
it's exactly what RJ just said, right? Which is, you can't have any ham, but this is how much ham you could have in soup.
Right.
Like, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, you're not getting rid of the remainder. That isn't going to happen. We don't live in a perfect world. We're not going to live in a perfect world. There's no perfection, right?
The answer
but
is,
it's important to draw a border too.
the answer is both 1/60th and 42. So that's a different conversation. So, but it's important because 1/60th is about flatness, and 42 is about verticality. See Douglas Adams.
Okay. So from 42 we go to chapter 24. So authority and power. And this has more to do with the establishment of a hierarchy, and it's another example of kind of the same pattern, just a different example.
So,
Do
do you
we
mind if
have
I,
anything
real
to
quick,
add?
before
Please
we
go
kind of
ahead.
get into this? I spent 4.5 hours on this morning, so I'll try to be brief. But I wanted to just put on the table, well, first of all, first, just to give examples of this whole pyramid thing that Castle Adams showed and RJ. One thing this morning in Genesis, when the birds are akin to order, it's because they're in the light, and when the fish are in the chaos, it's because they're in the darkness. One simple way to understand this is the experience of that. The stars and the birds have patterns. They're not clockwork-like patterns, but when you look at birds and stars, they do have more easily discernible patterns, and the things below are hidden and in the darkness. But so I just wanted to first just give that example because it's a simple example to understand that pyramidal structure. But then secondly, I wanted to put on the table, there are two kinds of mythology. There's more, but there are two that were referenced in Genesis 3. The first is an orderly procession of being, which proceeds from above to below. So that's, the paradisal garden. Things fall down from their identities and come together. And the second is the revolutionary trope, or the death, or the problem of death. It's basically when Eve, eats the fruit. It's grasping, for identity from below. And so that's a second mythological trope. That's pattern is present in chapter 22 and 23. So that pattern is also in the curse. So chapter 22 talks about the lowering of the breath and the raising of dust. It's the same pattern. And chapter 23 is the same when it talks about the lowering of laws, and the raising of, or the lowering of answers and the raising of question. You have the problem of chaos coming up from the bottom up, and that can take the form of the problem of the pattern of rebellion, or the problem of death. And so to illustrate this, in Genesis 3, the curse is from dust you are, and to dust you will return. And so when God curses the serpent and says, you'll be on the ground and eat of only dust, he's saying you'll only eat or feed on that which has no identity, the things which aren't connected to each other. So what he's saying is that you will be chaos, and you will be nothing but chaos. He's saying you will be only chaos, rather than the potential from which beings can come, right? You'll eat chaos. And so he's going to continue to be that revolutionary trope, perpetually, right? And so that's when he'll bite at the heel of man, and then man will crush his head, which is to impose order on the serpent. And he, we can get into the curse on the level of the woman and the man. But I'm seeing the same mythological pattern present in all of these chapters. Does that make sense? There's kind of a lot. There's a lot more to be said about that as well. But
could I add just a couple of things, because I just read a couple of things today that complement your point. So a couple of the things is you do see that same sort of grasping thing happen. You see that with Cain killing Abel. He kind of, his offering isn't accepted, and then he kind of, goes and tries to usurp, or, and then that backfires on him. And then you have Esau coming after Jacob to kill him after the kind of debacle with the birthright. But I just today read a really kind of a really strong example of what Danny was just talking about here, where there's a part in the Acts of the Apostles where at this point King Herod has killed a bunch of people. He's already killed John the Baptist. He killed one of the apostles and everything. And then he gets up in his royal garb and he gives an oration. And the people start shouting that he's a god and not a man. Like they're worshiping King Herod. And it says, like, right after, an angel appears, strikes him down, and he's eaten by worms and then breathes his last. And it's like, whoa, that is that pattern in like just a screaming way, that Danny just pointed out. It's like, oh my goodness. It's just like, yeah, he didn't breathe his last until the worms ate him. It's like, that's terrifying. But but it's also a really dramatic example of that same pattern.
The presence of the pattern occurring in microcosm like that, even sort of figuratively. Daniel, I would recommend to you series The Lost World of by John H. Walton. It posits almost, well, they're propositions. So they're directly they're listed out propositions. Going back to an earlier part of the conversation, I would recommend The Lost World Genesis 1, certainly as a complement to this book. But to what you guys were just discussing a moment ago, Castle and Daniel, and the microcosm thing about what happens to kings and prophets and stuff. Walton just released The Lost World of the Prophets, and this specifically is discussed as propositional statements, which I would highly recommend, again, as a companion to this point in the conversation.
Yeah, more examples would be castrating the father or devouring the children. It makes heaven a tyrant. It's having to get from above. And so it makes all of the patterns forms of oppression. And therefore I have to set myself free. So I go out and I take fire from the gods and I do all these things to take power on myself. That's the revolutionary trope in a nutshell.
And I think, and it's like, it's kind of explicitly one of those things that like Jesus doesn't do wrong, and he exemplifies that. It's just like, oh yeah, like I could literally lay claim on stuff, but also I'm not going to grasp at something even though I have. And it's just like that is one of those things that is kind of that I had kind of commented on one of Mark's videos this week about that. It's like, oh yeah, it's exemplifying, like, even though it's difficult because you're seeing a man, that he's exemplifying like the complementarity of the feminine, like with relationship to himself, essentially.
So what do we want to say about 24 here? Are we have
I'm
questions?
happy to move on, and I would actually prefer if we moved on, because chapter 25 has a lot of meat in it, and I wanna
Okay,
hit that. Unless
Is
Just
everybody-
real quick,
Let's
just
flash
related
through
to
the
the
diagram
title.
first.
It says authority and power. The answer to the problem is self-sacrifice as the manner in which we hold things together. The way that bodies are held together or to have right authority is through self-sacrifice, which is essentially the story of Christ. So that's all.
Yeah, Gustavs, I want to go through the diagrams because this is like the key for me to the whole.
I think you have to be the one to put them up. I'm pretty sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
Do we want to just go to the last diagram of the chapter?
Nope. I want to go through the whole thing.
Which chapter? 24?
Okay.
It's 24. Yeah.
But I agree with Gustav.
24.
The only thing
So
better
this
than
is the
24
diagram, right?
is.
No, that's not what I
No.
have.
Yep, this is 24. Isn't it?
No, that's 23.
Oh no, apologies. So this is that one. Why are we?
Yeah, can you go to the one
why is
before
this
that?
Yeah, go to the one before that though.
Sorry, it's
You gotta go through
jumping
them in order.
around. I'm not sure why.
Oh, a little
Okay.
fast.
It's jumping around.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can.
It's out of control.
There we
There
go.
we go.
All right. Download more RAM, Father Eric. Just by the way, if you go on Navigating Patterns YouTube channel, feel free to comment in the live chat. I can put you up here. We love to have the audience comment too if they have questions. Yeah, I just want to point out how this, right, because it does follow the same pattern as the previous chapter, right? But like there's a head, and the head just can't manage. A head can only manage so much population, and so you have to have a way not to multiply the head, because you need only a single head, right? Hydras are bad. All right, and so this is exemplifying again the same pattern from before, with the question marks representing population now. In other words, they're far more complex because they're beings in some sense, right? Then how do you manage them? Well, you put some of them between the head and the population. In other words, you create a new class, if you will. That's the point of Plato's Republic, Book 7. So this is not an optional formula, right? You have to have this mediator, and the mediator for the head is now the body, right? And then you see authority is informing and the power is expressing, right? And that's really important, because this is not optional in the world ever. It's not something you can get around. It's not a problem to be solved. It's not an error to be corrected. It's not something that needs to be fixed. You're stuck with this. And so and does anybody have any questions about this one before we move to the last one, so we can get to the hard chapter, to Gustav's point? Okay. Here we go. So this is the last one, right? Which just, again, where this I think, and RJ will correct me if I'm wrong, this is just a mapping, right? Of you have the same structure, and what you're doing is you're changing the objects within the structure, or the pattern, navigating patterns. Thank you to Manuel for coming up with that name, because I wasn't smart enough to do it. So this pattern is repeated at the next scale up, if you will, or maybe not the next scale up, but at a higher scale. And that higher scale in this diagram is heavenly and earthly, right? And so appointing is maps to authority, right? Or anointing and appointing maps to authority and informing, and tithing and taxation maps to power and expression. And that's actually really important to understand, that this is the same structure, right? Or the same pattern, just at a different scale. Because one of the things people are missing is scale. When you try to squish or flatten the world or equalize the world, you end up with no scale. But the world has scale, and things operate differently at different scales with a similar pattern, which is really confusing. So hopefully that is clear. Does anybody have any questions? Does everybody, you don't have to understand the whole thing, but like, do you see the congruence with the previous chapters and stuff? Because this is sort of the bridge to 25, in my opinion. If you're struggling with 25, it's probably because you're not quite understanding the diagrams in 24.
I would just say something that's notable for this particular diagram is to notice that tithing and taxation are on the right, going up with a darkened arrow, and on the left, appointing and anointing is down with a white arrow. How light and dark are used in the actual diagrams is significant. It's actually rather hard to see sometimes, but there's actually a slight shading difference on the middle level as to the bottom level here, just to make that a bit more salient for folks. But to the point about taxation and tithing and appointing and anointing, it is significant to understand, or at least to see, that anointing is a coming down of something, and it's making contact with earth on the anointed person. And when you're giving things up, and taxation, I don't think we really need to go into that. Most people are familiar with tithing is aimed towards. But that was just for the folks at home who may not be able to ask questions on the rerun.
Yeah, and I think it's so. Just if I can also make a point about the dark tithing going up and the anointing coming down, is that as a person who is within that hierarchy somewhere, or as a thing that's within that hierarchy, you need the anointing, the thing that is coming down onto you from above. You need to know the full chain of custody, I guess you could say. Like, you need to be sure that it comes from the highest point. It's like if you're being anointed by a priest, you need to know his bishop and how he got ordained and all that sort of stuff. You need to know the chain of succession. However, with tithing and taxation, you kind of don't really care what's below the person you're receiving it from. It's like if you're a lord, you get the tithe from your baron or whoever's below you, and you know that there's a hierarchy below him, but you don't really care about that. You don't get involved with that. It's beyond the necessary information. So
Right.
that also has to do with the darkness, the perceptivity.
No, that's a good point, and there's a utility in that, right? There's more to it than mere utility, of course, but there's a utility in that I can pay the taxes or the tithing for my neighbor, and the fact that he didn't pay is not relevant because the debt was paid, right? It might be relevant between us at the scale of individual, but that's actually not relevant at the scale, to your point, above. That's why it's murky, because it shouldn't actually have that much of an impact.
Yep. Okay.
Everybody good on this?
Yeah, just a quick response to the whole idea of needing to understand where things come from. I think the benefit or the power of religious stories is that we don't need all of us to understand them at the most subtle level. You can have an uneducated and in a basic understanding, and hopefully that's enough to instill the behavioral patterns of loving your neighbor, etc. So
Well said.
I think there's a lot that's encapsulated that shadows down the layers.
So if there's not anything else for chapter 24, in the eternal words of SpongeBob, the only thing better than 24 is indeed 25.
And 25 is good.
25 is
so
very
25 has a lot to do with the family dynamics, the multiplication. Multiplication is very important. I have diagrams on that prepared. It has to do with the different levels of materiality and lightness, darkness, reproduction. Lots of diagrams and kind of new ones or new ways of looking at the old diagrams. So how about Olena, do you have something you would like to ask or add or comment?
Yeah, this was an overarching question for 25 is it talks about how Cain's sacrifice was not accepted, and within the context of heaven and earth and the union of those, what would have been Cain's proper role for that sacrifice? Like, is it that Cain doesn't, his role isn't to sacrifice, his role is simply the support for the sacrifice of Abel? And in that case, yeah, I guess just what is Cain's role? What is Cain's role in?
I have some notes on that.
Because he says, okay, yeah, just one more thing to add, because he says that Cain's offering, God accepted the offering of Abel rather than Cain because one is higher than the other in vertical space of this cosmology. It's not Cain's role to try to take that position of that higher level. So what is his role?
So Cain, the earthly sort of polarity still can raise matter, but some of it is not going to be necessarily accepted unless it's raised sufficiently. So I don't remember, was it in a previous chapter where he talked about Abraham's wife making the cakes, and then also there was the youth that prepared the animal, that the angels only, I actually have the diagram on this. So the angels only accepted the thing that was closer up to their level. So I kind of have this here, and we're going to have a diagram that comes up here that this better exemplifies. But It kind of goes in terms of less corporeality. So I kind of have it there like light. I only have so many markers. And then you have the red. So I'm also doing this like unprocessed materials or unrefined materials. So you have kind of like the meat, and then you have the vegetative, and then you have the mineral. So these things, there is a sort of a sequence of progression that needs to kind of happen all the way through. To Gustav's point, it's on the way down. It's not necessarily 100%. There is still kind of like mediation, but there's certain things that are a little incongruous. But with respect to the offerings, Abel is using discernment. So I'm going to put this away real quick. But Abel's using discernment. So it says that Abel had gone and offered one of the flock. It doesn't actually, it's something I would kind of mention. He doesn't actually say he killed it, but he discerned from the ones that were, it's tough to tell. I looked at a bunch of translations. It's tough to say if he took the fat from the ones that were fat, or if he just singled out one from among the ones that were fat. So he had the flock, and then he had the fat ones, and then he picked from among the fat ones. It doesn't necessarily say he killed it, which I find is interesting, because the being allowed to eat meat wasn't actually put into place until the time of Noah, after the flood was over. But there's that kind of discernment, and then kind of you're seeing the refinement and kind of picking the best one, and then he's offering it. It doesn't say that Cain actually discerned his grain offering quite as well. And in Leviticus, in order to prepare your grain offering, so to your question, Elena, the grain offering was accepted by God in the time of Leviticus, but in order to offer that, which you didn't have to do this much stuff to the animal, you still had to prepare it and stuff, but you had to add oil and frankincense to the offering of the grain and then burn it. So you're kind of doing this refining thing where let me put some oil on it, so now it reflects light better, and then I'm going to put the scented thing on it, which also kind of rises up, and then I'm going to set the whole thing on fire. And like that is kind of the proper offering, but it doesn't seem like Cain actually did that. And then God tries to comfort Cain a little bit and says, oh, if you keep trying, like I might actually accept your offering. But then Cain got kind of impatient. But it's interesting that the earth guy, when not connected to the heavenly guy or the head guy who is kind of doing the discernment, Cain, disconnected from Abel, is actually not able to discern. Like he has separated himself from the higher bit, and now he's just kind of taking whatever he's got in front of him. And maybe it's decent, but it's not his best stuff. He hasn't even really looked to see if it was his best.
Exactly. It's at the level of the material when you're looking across horizontally. It all looks the same. All grain is the same. All animals are the same, right? It doesn't matter which one you give up because they're roughly the same. And that's the flattening of the world. That's the materialism sort of infecting things. And I just want to point out, Matthieu says, in a perfect world, Cain and Abel would have been able to reach an agreement by which spiritual and material realities would have been joined correctly. In that case, Abel would cover Cain with spiritual meaning from heaven, and Cain would support Abel with physical power from the earth. Okay, and so there's a sense that Cain just has a problem cooperating, right? He doesn't cooperate with his brother, obviously. He doesn't cooperate with God because he just decides, what is it taking too long for me to figure out how to do a sacrifice that gets favor? And so I'm going to stop even trying, right? And so you can see there's three things going on here, right? There's a sort of a neutral position where people are trying to give up the right thing, not succeeding, right? But trying. Then there's the succeeding at giving up the right thing, or hopefully if they both did it, there would be all this cooperation going on, right? And everybody would get benefit out of it. And then ultimately, there's the rebellion. That's three different ways of valences for approaching the world.
This agreement between the two implies one sacrifice between the two. Is that right?
Well, in order for people to cooperate at all, there's a sacrifice implied, right?
But it's not going to be like either parts with their own sacrifice.
It could look many different ways.
If I could give a liturgical example, I literally just experienced today. So, and a lot of times you experience this on Sundays more kind of explicitly, but at the Mass, you have the priest is doing all of the stuff that someone who is profane like me, or which is to say common, not necessarily disgusting. That's the original word. There is a point in the Mass right around the time of the consecration where he's about to go and he's about to kind of do the lifting and raising at his higher level. And at that point, at least on Sundays, that is when the tithing is invited. They have the offertory, so you kind of offer whatever your offering is, but you're also offering your petitions. So they're explicitly saying, there's this kind of part in the Mass where they go and they say, oh, here's all of these intentions that we have, whatever it is, end of war, end of poverty, all these different things, sometimes specific people who are, sick or something like that. And at the end of every single one, they present the enigma, and then the people say, Lord, hear our prayer. And you do that for all of the intentions. And then around the same time, you're offering up your material, your money or whatever you got, and also your personal intentions that you didn't talk about in that point. And then that's right before the consecration, and then the people receive communion. So that's kind of an explicit liturgical example of my offering is not even close to the same level of offering, but also I am participating simultaneously at my respective level, and then I'm benefiting just as well at the same time. So I'm receiving the thing and I'm offering support. I'm bearing and then I'm being covered.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people want like an answer, right? And then that's where you run into religious wars, actually. Right? The proper way to do the liturgy or to cooperate, because liturgy is a form of cooperation between levels that can't normally mix or don't need to, or shouldn't have to or something. The proper way to do this is X. And it's like, well, there's probably lots of ways that work well enough. Right. And that's that middle state, right? Which is a good state, because if you haven't perfected it, it keeps going. That's not a bad thing with respect to life. It's like everyone wants to live forever to some extent, like in some way. So you want it to keep going. And like if you came up with the perfect thing, that would be the end of everything. So don't do that. And don't try to do that. It's not required, right? You can just keep it going. There's lots of ways to cooperate. I mean, we're all here giving up our time, energy, and attention to this, right? Gustav has stepped up because Manuel's not here, right? Manuel has uncooperated for this book club in some sense, right? But he was responsible and left the responsibilities for some of the technical setup to me, obviously, since I have admin access, and some of the responsibilities of actually moving through the motions of the book club, because we're not just opening the book and talking about it. We've got this intentions thing that we found works really well, right? And made sure those were farmed out, and they're split between two people even, right? Whereas normally Manuel would kind of handle everything pretty much. So there's lots of ways to cooperate, right? And just there's lots of ways to cooperate in the book club, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the indication here is that the cooperation wasn't being done, and the patience wasn't there, and so the rebellion started, and that goes back to what Danny was saying earlier, right?
So I think this, excuse me, I think this pretty neatly covers some of what's in this chapter. We've touched on, in a roundabout way, we've touched on Noah, which of course brings us, to Cain and Abel, and to the microcosm embeddedness of Seth. So this is not a Seth is not a microcosm in this diagram that we'll see next. But the one thing that I just wanted to raise up, make salient, was on page 90 of the physical copy, in the paragraph that's just under the spiritual, animal, vegetable, mineral stuff that we have on screen, to the whole point about our discussion about Cain and what he's relaying, or so to speak, what Cain relays is it's reflected here. Matthieu says, in this hierarchy of meaning and matter, the mineral level is closest to meaningless matter, in quotes, while spiritual level is closest to, and again in quotes, intangible meaning. So the interplay, going back to some of our earlier sessions, is what I see as being gestured at here. But the scaling thing is again happening when we look at Seth, and when we look at the tripartite level of embeddedness on the very last diagram of this chapter.
So I want to present my diagram now. I think it's a good time. Can I get put up bigger somehow? All right, thank you. So these multiple diagrams, I wanted to show how the multiplication and the growth, which is in the chapter, it's quite a big feature, how the multiplication and growth look in the different diagrams. So kind of bringing them together, comparing them, and seeing how they match up. So looking at the top one, so on the left-hand side, we have the multiplication. So we have the principle, and then it has the waters underneath it, right? We'll get to that, but I hope it makes sense anyway. And then you have the questions underneath it, but they're not integrated into the structure. And then going through multiplication, the X on top of the arrow is supposed to be a multiplication sign, but it didn't work out like I thought it would. And then on the right-hand side, you have the structure. Then moving to the next diagram, which I think is first shown in this diagram, in this chapter 25, we have Adam on the left-hand side, and then he gets multiplied into Abel and Cain. And then you have the heavenly part and the earthly part. And it's significant that the circle in the middle, the Adam thing, it grows bigger, right? Like it becomes a bigger circle, and the heaven, earth sort of, it seems to retreat. I'm not sure it actually retreats, but the Adam, the human mediator part, it gets bigger. And then the third diagram is how I tried to map it onto the pyramid that we had earlier of the earthly and the heavenly. And sort of on the left-hand side, you have Adam sort of mediating from the principle downwards into the questions, into the materiality, but he has a sort of limit to how much he can do himself. And then by multiplying into Abel and Cain, he can delegate the different responsibilities, and that allows the domain of Adam to reach further into the world, sort of further outwards and further downwards as well. And I think this also definitely has to do with how when Cain sort of multiplies, it manifests also as a kind of heaviness, as a weightiness, as a like materialism, materiality, iron and weapons and technology and all that kind of stuff. It kind of gets bottom heavy as it gets bigger.
Gustav,
So
could
I
you
don't know if that
continue
makes
to
sense.
hold that up, actually?
Of course.
Thank you. There's something interesting that I'm seeing you do here by having on the bottom right-hand diagram Abel be on top of Cain. I don't
Yes.
see it as not fitting. I hate to use the double negatives, but I'm not in a position where I can make a positive statements. I don't see it as in disagreement with what we're discussing and looking at here. Though some people who may not have listened to the entire conversation might point out that having Abel on top of Cain, really in any context, is kind of like, well, they're brothers, so how is one on top of the other? But then again, one is born first, et cetera, et cetera. But to the specifics about the diagram here, and having Abel on top and Cain on the bottom allows me to bring up the following point, or again, early, not even really from a session, but is alluded to specifically in the book, Adam's two functions, and that is naming, which is perhaps seen or given on to Abel, and tending of the garden, which is really interesting given the vocations, occupations, way of cultivating, whatever you want to call it, that these two individuals have. So that's something that I would not have come across, and want to give you your flowers for allowing me to see. So thank you. And then I'll be right back.
Well, I think the aspect of them being brothers is shown in the first one, right, where they're next to each other. I think that makes it really clear. But I think also that last one with Abel being on top, I think that's a bit confusing because Cain is the firstborn, right? And it must have been humiliating for him to be to be the earthly one. It
Thank you
brings
for
up
the
lots of
correction.
trains of thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's long book, many stories. It's hard to keep remember who was born when.
It
But
seems
it's
like
actually important, and thank you.
that pattern of kind of, that God, like the first couple of days of creation, that it was dark and confounding and everything, that you had kind of the confounding materiality came first, and then after that then you got light. Seems to be something that that sort of happens here with some of these guys, like, and then the reunification, as kind of shows in one of these later diagrams, that you have kind of the separate polarity between the heaven guy and the earth guy, and then after that you get Seth, who is kind of the representation of Adam as the complete sort of unity, and then he's kind of like the progenitor of the post-flood humanity, in a sense, which is interesting because they actually say that after Seth came about, that Seth had a child whose name is translated as humanity, and then men began to call upon the name of the Lord again. And which is very interesting, that it's just like, okay, the reunification guy is then like the father of a guy named humanity, but also Abel never had kids. Cain's descendants get wiped out in the flood. So saying Seth has, begets humanity, and then people start calling on the name of the Lord now that the reunification has kind of happened again.
So Casty, it turns out there's a lot in a name, to borrow from the Bard, especially when it comes to these texts. That's fun to play with, and a whole other world with funny names to itself. It's important to look at, and this brings us back to Father Eric's original earlier point at the very beginning of the stream. I want to take that with a grain of salt, that what I just said, because I'm going to take that, throw it to the side, and say, look at how he uses Enoch, or is it Enosh? Yes, Enoch. It's Enoch in the very last diagram of this chapter, but I'm front running. But that's what I was pointing at with Gustavus's diagram. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if we're able to pull out stuff before we get there, then I don't think we're doing a bad job.
Can someone else add something? Someone wants to butt in, maybe Danny?
Nope.
I had one more comment about this chapter. Mostly to Mark, because one time I brought up heaven and earth as opposites, and you kind of pushed back on that, and I didn't understand completely why. He does kind of use that wording as well in a footnote. So I just wanted to ask why you were just not accepting of opposites as the frame for that.
So I think actually Manuel started this whole thing with that. He said in number one, right? He said explicitly, Matthieu is putting things in opposites, and I don't like that. And I'm obviously on the same train. I'm like, I mean, you have to, for certain things, it's not invalid to put things as opposites, but you got to remember the root word oppose means set against. So you're the agent doing the setting. The setting is framing, right? Setting is perspective, right? You're doing that. That's not a feature outside of you. It's a feature that's only in you, in fact. And it's this weird, inversion, right? To some extent, to keep in the Pageauian language, right? Where, or flipping, if you want to put it that way, right? Where in some sense, there's more spirit than there is material, right? But in another sense, there's more bad below than there is good above, which is why you have to work or strive to be good. You see my live stream from last night on navigating patterns. You have to put the effort in, because it's not an equal weighted equation, right? And the physicists actually ran into this problem, right? They started to do these weird calculations where they were like, why is there more matter than antimatter? Which, is possibly the dumbest sort of a question you could ever ask. In some sense, it's like, obviously there is. I don't know. Why are you, under the physics framing? So it's not equal. Therefore, they're not in, quote, opposition, right? And that's fine. but putting them in opposition for the purpose of contrast, exemplification, because you have to frame it somehow. Of course, like you have to, but also to Manuel's earlier point, in when he opened chapter 1, I think when he opened the book club, like, don't like that. You're going to be careful with that, because it can get you down a rabbit hole of thinking that, oh, well, we can frame the world as opposites, and then you get into to use John Vervaeke's term, opponent processing, which is garbage. We're here cooperating. There are no opponents here. We're not opposed to one another, right? We're all here in the book club. Peterson talks about this, right? Everybody who's playing the game has agreed to play the game by the rules. Whether they break them or not is a different issue, right? But they've already agreed that the game is worth playing.
And that's why I was trying to kind of, when I have presented a few of my points, I was making a point of kind of saying, like complementary polarity, that it's a little more cooperative to phrase it that way, because you imagine like two bookends, they're not opposed to each other. In common parlance, you might say they're on opposite sides of the book, but they're on polar sides of the books. And then you have a whole multiplicity that can now stand between the two of them that otherwise would have fallen over if you didn't have the two contrasts on either end. So Matthieu uses the word opposites, and also he's appealing to a group, to a demographic that is starting without kind of specialized terms, so that he can kind of reach a large audience. I think explicitly he's trying to reach, I think, a Jewish audience with a lot of his work, but that it's the same sort of concept. But I think within the bounds of this book club, we've been kind of using more cooperative terms, just because opposite and opposition has been very overused culturally, I think. And as Mark said, it's more like a dualistic sort of like a one is vying for control of the other one type of thing, whereas it's a cooperative complementarity type of thing. So it's a semantic issue, kind of.
Okay. I understand that, and I don't disagree with any of it. The only point that I would like to kind of make is that, and I think this comes back to the reviews we were having last time as well. It seems when you make a statement like that, it is done from a more heavenly place, and that's kind of okay and fine, because you have to, can't escape it, especially in abstract reasoning. But like RJ was trying to mention the first couple of times we started this, you have to keep in mind that your position is in the middle. And I don't know if maybe I'm a little bit lower down, and so these kind of abstractions that, not abstractions, but this type of more higher position is just something that's relative to like the way that I'm coming from. But if you're standing from that middle position of the two, then you can't, making those statements is like, it makes sense, but then it also doesn't make sense. I know
it requires
I'm
a lot
not
of
explaining
examples.
this for much.
I think I know what you, because Matthieu, I think in the foreword or something in the introduction, he says something about a lot of the kind of things that he's proposing here are going to be too simple to properly grasp, because they require a huge amount of examples. So that's what, I tried to use kind of like the more physical examples or analogies of like the bookends or like polarity and these different types of contrast. But it really does sometimes require, like, some of these examples take huge quantities of examples to actually really ingrain so that you can actually do anything with it practically. And that's something that I think there was a previous chapter, and I think he goes into it more later, about there's like the like, what is the unifying principle between a blade and a stairway? And it's like, I have no idea, and it's just like, oh, it's an inclined plane. But if I just say to you inclined plane, and you haven't encountered blades and axe heads and stairs and handicap walkways and all these different types of things, then there's not enough data to kind of there's not enough body to support that heavenly idea. So some of these things also, as we kind of go along through the chapters, Matthieu is also going to give us a huge amount of examples. But some of this stuff, it's kind of like in seed form, and it's also frustrating because we also have to like wait for that seed to grow a little bit. And so because it's underground and very subtle, we're not seeing it do anything. So it seems like it's not doing anything.
Right. But I also want to point out that not everybody's in the same place. Right. There isn't a horizontal plane. That's not real. Right. I mean, there is one, but we're not all standing on it. Right. And we're not all the same height. Even if we were all standing on it, wouldn't matter. Right. And so we all have slightly different perspectives. Some are higher and some are lower for sure. And then the point of this book club in particular, hopefully all book clubs, but certainly the one we're intending with doing the book club as such, is to take, we'll say, maybe a higher perspective in one area that I have and a higher perspective in an area that RJ has, and we're combining them, right? So that people have more perspectives, right? And those perspectives are higher than other people's, and other people are doing the same for us at the same time. And I'm saying this explicitly, and I know this for sure because RJ and I have talked about this already, right? Which not in that way. What was said was, oh, I really like what you pointed out here because I didn't notice that, right? And I've said the same to him, right? And that's what's supposed to happen. We're supposed to take our limited perspectives, our limited intelligence, our limited understanding, and combine it together in the book club, live, hopefully, or at least on video for people in sequence, so that other people can also maybe get a similar enough understanding, or at least get more understanding than they had before. And so hopefully with this particular group, and I say that specifically for this particular group, it may not apply to any other group ever in history, although I doubt that, no one is likely to claim something that they actually don't understand without giving the caveat. And you've heard everybody, I think, give caveats. Maybe I'm not quite understanding this correctly, but this is how I see it, sort of a thing, right? And so no one's inappropriately raising themselves up, at least that I've caught, and I probably would because that's just my nature, unfortunately. And so that makes it okay, in my opinion. Okay, so from my authority, from having done these sorts of book clubs before and participated in a few that I had nothing to do with other than as a participant, I think this is in the correct spirit. And I'm not saying no one else is. I'm just saying for sure, because this is something that I am participating in and partially helped organize, that we're not making that any kind of mistake along those lines. I'm speaking about everybody here, right? So, and maybe that will change, but so far, I think so good.
So
hopefully that helps.
hopefully to maybe demonstrate some of what we're talking about, and to hopefully make good on some of my own intentions. I'll start with Elena, but I guess this is really for all of us. When I walked away briefly to get some water, I heard you asking about heaven and earth being opposites. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the particular discussion, but I have a question since you had that question. Kind of wherever you guys landed on that piece of the conversation. Does it make sense to you when I talk about how the yin yang, is a reflection of heaven and earth, but also specifically in a way shows how they're not in opposition, they're cooperating, they're in interdynamic, they're in interrelation, but not necessarily in relational ontologically so.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. I guess my biggest like shtick is that saying that heaven and earth collaborate from a higher place, making that statement from a higher place, is a place, let's say, of responsibility that you're taking upon yourself for sure,
Yeah.
and you shouldn't do it lightly. So
Right.
I guess that's
No, well, and then I'll have to tell you the backstory. People were like, we want to do a book club on this book. And the first time they said it, I said, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. It took a year for people to convince me in particular that I would participate. And I think Manuel too, although he's not here. So, and I don't remember all the details. It's like over a year ago. Right. And then people did it again. And I was like, I don't want to do a book club on that book. I want to do a book club on any other book, just not that one, right?
Even Moby Dick.
And then I was convinced that no, we can handle this. This is okay for us to do, right? And that was a convincing. I didn't take any of this light. I don't take anything that I do lightly. I didn't take this lightly at all. I actually I'm sure Manuel will tell you, I was kind of like, nah, I don't want to touch that. Manuel wanted to do it.
Point of order. Is
Yeah.
that a very serious drawing of animal in the background, sir?
Yes.
Okay, very serious business. Okay, got it. Keep
Yes.
going. Thank you.
That's from my live stream last night. My laziness at not cleaning my board, but
Serious business, Mark.
serious business. But I mean, it is a serious book club, right? And it's not. It wasn't decided like everybody wants to do a book club. Let's just do it. That didn't even happen. And you have no way to know that. And like, fair enough, whatever. But like, also that happened. Like there was a lot of contention around even just doing the book club. And the thing is, it's not like you can't speak of something you're involved in. However tangentially you may be involved in, we'll say, combining heaven and earth, because that, I mean, according to the book, like if that's your role, right? That's what persons do, right? That being a person is about the combining of heaven and earth. And so speaking about the thing you're involved in, I mean, I think that's fair, right? Like if I built the network, I can talk about the network that I built, right? If I didn't design the network, I can still talk about the work that I did. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't see a particular conflict there.
Yeah, I get that. Just like in more general terms, I'll think about that. But like speaking in collaboration to me from a higher level, just like don't forget the black dot in the white part of the yang, I guess.
There is an exchange there. I think that was what I was trying to kind of exemplify a little bit with my kind of liturgical example, that it's like I'm existing in the black half. Or actually, it would be, we're going to start getting into colors soon. So actually the polarity is red and white. That'll come up in later chapters. But I'm in that lower half, and I'm kind of mediating in that kind of Cain space, in a sense, raising up my grain, trying to discern it, and then raising up my enigmas and my, what offering I have and everything. And then I'm then receiving everything I need to continue doing everything else I'm doing. And I continue to get better regularly. By doing that cooperation, by providing that support and that carrying, I'm receiving the covering. And the even the word protection actually means to go before and cover. So I'm receiving the covering. I'm receiving I'm being informed. I'm given form, and I'm also raising up matter of myself, my intentions, my material, all of these things. And then with that, we can kind of continue going. But definitely, like I wouldn't want to disregard the dignity of the lower half, because I've literally operated it 100% of the time. I mean, there's kind of that head and body thing where I act in the masculine in a lot of things, but also I'm acting in the feminine in a lot of things. And, and that's, it's not static either. So, and that's also with those two dots, that there's an exchange going on all the time. So a lot of things are moving up, and a lot of things are moving down, and so things are sharing, but there's also clear lines between, you can tell which one is heaven and which one is earth, but also they're sharing with each other.
If I could add one point and pull back for just a moment, still very much engaging with the book. I don't know if you guys have ever heard the aphorism, "To the man with a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail." On a certain level, when you engage with the text as such, or with a narrative as such, or as with a person that is going on, when and I have to give flowers again, Castle, you do a great job of engaging with the text in the language of the text to my ear. Then again, I'm not anyone in particular. I'm RJ online with intent. That's all who I am. But Elena, in a sense, when we're engaging with the book, this is our hammer. And the thing about this book is saying that our bodies are a hammer. So part of the worldview that we're engaging with here is a abstraction of our own experience from a certain perspective. Daniel, maybe you'll have some thoughts on this. But some of the diagrams here, and in as much as we are, to use the language that this book borrows from, sons of Adam, children of Adam, in the lineage of Adam, like a fruit is in a lineage of its parent tree. We have these functions. We name, we tend, sometimes we kill. But to the point that I'm making is when you're looking at a given diagram, I'm not trying to look at myself and say, where is this diagram? How does this work? I'm looking at the diagram and thinking about, okay, he has said heaven means XYZ, earth means 1, 2, 3, Adam means ABC, and that there's a grammar to the relationships here, and then this is called the language of creation. So I'll stop rambling at that point because I have a cool football hat on, not a tinfoil hat on. But hopefully, I'll ask Elena, does that make any sense to you, what I was sharing?
I didn't follow everything, but I think I got the gist, hopefully.
Is anybody
Yeah.
able to help me clarify for Elena?
Well, I was just looking at the blessing that God gives in the beginning of Genesis, where he goes, a lot of people only reference the be fruitful and multiply part of the blessing, but there's actually a little more about that I think is interesting. He says to fill the earth and subdue it. Now, people think subdue is like, oh, I'm going to tyrannize it, but really subducere means to draw from below. And in Hebrew, I think the word also is connected to lamb. So it's like fill the earth and shepherd it, and then have dominion. And dominus means lordship, but also it's from the word dome, which means home. So it's this kind of thing of like, okay, treat as your home, shepherd the inhabitants. All of these things are given, both of these directions are given to Adam and Eve simultaneously. So these are things that they're going to, each one is going to, in a complementary way, have something that they do a little more of or less of. But the charge is strictly given to both of them, that, that Adam was made in female, he made them. Like that's kind of, the human was made in those two complementary halves. And so we're going to see a lot of this kind of happening at the various scales, whether it's, from the cosmic or the communal and then all the way down to the personal, that you're going to see a lot of this, still the kind of the raising and lowering, but it's a lot like, if you had people that, if you're on like an assembly line, almost like, I don't want to overly materialize it, but it's like, okay, there's someone over here I got to pass this thing to, and then also they're going to pass me something else, and we're going to kind of keep the ball rolling a little bit. But yeah, it just, I think that's kind of similar to what RJ was kind of saying, is that all of this stuff is very much, there's a dignity to both of them, and also it's a little difficult to see one or the other. Or specifically the earth one is a little bit difficult to discern sometimes, because of the aspect of the masculine protecting or the covering over. A lot of times kind of the feminine or earthly aspect, in a sense, it's referred to by Matthieu as confounding, but a lot of times it's veiled in a sense by that type of covering. So a lot of times you have this kind of difficulty of perceiving it. And you kind of need the heavenly or masculine aspect to perceive sometimes. And I think that might be demonstrated a little bit with like, that the material reality was made first, but it was also dark and like nobody could kind of understand it. But then when light is shined onto it, then now you can have all this other stuff. That it's a little difficult to kind of get to the hidden thing. And Mark talks about this too, like the feminine is usually hidden, and like also, like it's precious, but also hidden. And a lot of times it's like, someone has kind of built a wall around it or a veil around it generally as a form of protection or covering. But then also you have that aspect of, okay, well, I only see the one. So then, some people in their discernment might only think that that's the only one that's there.
Okay. And I know we should, sorry, is my audio really bad?
No, it's not bad. We're getting some echoey things occasionally.
Okay,
Don't
my
know
bad.
why.
I get that, and we should move on to go to more chapters. But from everything that you said, Castle, like this dynamic of lowering heaven and raising earth, I think is happening exactly in this group. And so, just if everybody would bear with me as I try to figure out how to do that well. Yeah.
We're all learning mediation as we go along through the book club. Like it's something that's in practice and being demonstrated for the folks at home.
It's not very easy to consider the lilies of the field at first.
Yeah, and
you need to cultivate a lot of attention and practice, and you can't just sit someone down and say, think about this lily for long enough and they'll get it. There's more to it. And one approach, one anything, one stool of a chair a one-legged chair is not much of a chair. So, and Matthieu acknowledges this about the book. So like I said, try not to expect to be able to get everything just by reading the book or just by looking at the diagrams, no matter how many times you do it. And if you're spending hours and hours and not getting something, it's probably because, it could perhaps be because I really apologize for that miswording there. You just need some time to digest it.
Yeah, and I wanna just go back again. I think head, body, population, authority, power, right? And so the reason why this is important, again, and I think this is mostly impossible for most people to understand. They skip over it because of the modern context, or the recent context that we have from society. It's actually really important to understand that it doesn't matter where you are in the diagram. You could be part of the body, or you could be part of the population, right? You have a role, and as long as you know where your role is, you're good. Like that's and the reason why that's important, particularly now, is because John Vervaeke talks about domicide. That's what domicide is. Domicide is not knowing your role. It's not having a role, and it's not having a particular type of role, or having a role that has certain abilities. That has nothing to do with domicide. It has to do with domicide is knowing where you are in that structure.
For more on roles, see the French. If you want to have a good time with something that, like I said, anything only in one direction is not very balanced, go read something in French. But citations are always important, so I'm thinking of Jean-Paul Sartre specifically.
There's also this kind of nested microcosm thing. So I have this little silly slide here with a few of the diagrams, but it's just the Russian nesting dolls. Like you can just kind of see that, if you remove any one of these in the sequence, then the whole thing rattles. That it's important to just kind of nest everything properly. You have, the personal and the communal, intercommunal, and the cosmic. And but then you're also kind of seeing this at various different levels. And then you're also seeing it with, Adam, and then you have the descendants kind of going down there. That there's this sort of aspect of, there is a home for like a nest, if you will, that everybody kind of exists in. And I have, I don't need to have authority over my mom, for example. It is just like, in fact, and an interesting thing, I think John, a couple of weeks ago when I was listening, John mentioned this a little bit, that, like, for example, even if there's a son, that the mom is masculine in relationship to the son, like the entire time, whether it's in gestation or even like as an infant, nursing the child or clothing the child as a toddler, or teaching him, the alphabet, or telling him as a teenager not to stay out too late. All of those things, the son is actually feminine in relationship to the mother. And so, and if those things agree, then you don't have, like there can be questions and stuff, and you can sort out things and let them kind of process. But ultimately, there's it's okay to kind of have those things nest properly, and when there's agreement, then you can actually start getting things done. And but it's like I said, it's okay to have the questions, and in fact, that's what we're seeing with like the enigmas being raised up. And it's necessary for people to kind of do that. Like that's why, you know, like Moses's judicial system, that some of the lower courts are not able to handle some of the questions, so then they raise it up again, and they raise it up until, you know, Moses is hearing the most difficult ones that got past all of the other levels. But they're also refining that, and then maybe that'll turn into a law later on, you know, if it was that much of a conundrum.
I have a pretty simple, well, I don't know, we'll see how simple it is. In the text, if we can bring up the text, a very direct question. I just don't really understand what's meant in it. So at the bottom of this page, of page 79, there's a footnote. Cain and Abel are opposite twins because they were born from the same knowledge. So if we disregard the thing about the opposite twins, like opposites, whatever, blah, 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 but what does it mean that they were born from the same knowledge? What's that pattern? Can someone explain? Or is everyone else...
multiplicity and unity, the interplay of the Tao, they come from the same place.
So just, I have a little one here. I colorized it. We're going to get to the colors in a later chapter, but it's the same chapters that are, it's the last page of chapter 25 is the kind of microcosm that comes up. But you have the one that is going to be, he demonstrates it where it's always on the left side is going to be the earth one, and then on the right side it's going to be the heavenly one, and then you have kind of like the heavenly progenitor or what have you from there. So you've got God, and you've got heaven and earth, or sorry, earth and heaven, and then you've got Adam, and then Cain and Abel, and then Seth and Noah and Enoch. And so that is sort of a pattern that's coming about where when you have, he's stating that within the biblical narratives, when you have a properly like unified representative of the central mediator Adam, that you're going to wind up their next children are going to kind of split off, or at least that's what kind of plays out in a lot of the biblical stories, like with Cain and Abel, or Noah and Enoch, or Jacob and Esau. This pattern tends to repeat itself throughout those stories. Like it doesn't necessarily happen for every single person that has a child, but also, can you necessarily guarantee that that particular person was a perfect unity between heaven and earth? It's kind of it's a very central thing that when it comes out to that way, then you wind up getting these kind of polarity with the children. And
so I think Gustavs, I want to point out that, right, the page before that, right, it basically says the human knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, right, and that she then gave birth to his brother Abel. So there's only one knowing in that part of the narrative. It's like, that's what it means. Whether they're twins certainly looks like it to me, but I'm not a biblical scholar, so I couldn't tell you. But that's what that indicates, at least with respect to the knowing. And the knowing, biblical knowing, as we know, hopefully everybody understands this. Biblical knowing is not like the normal way we recent folks use the idea of knowing. It's more participatory, if you will.
I think essence, purpose, and identity are at the core of all these repeated patterns we're talking about: heaven and earth, order and chaos, potentiality and darkness. You know, like when I see the name Cain and Abel, apparently Cain, like from this conversation, I don't really care about the details of the story, but I just think Cain, okay, the guy that lacks discernment. Like, okay, so then that's when I look at the pyramid of light and dark, or whatever, all these other pictures that we're looking at, the first thing I do in my mind is try to establish, what are the essences, what are the purposes, and what are the identities, and then I kind of fill the rest of the map out from there. And that's kind of been helpful for me to think through this. Does that make sense or help? I could elaborate on that a lot more, but
Nah, that makes sense. That makes sense. The other question I had that is directly related to this one is that you also have the diagram, the last one in chapter 25. Maybe we can bring that up. it has to do with the embeddedness of the different microcosms. So you have basically Seth being a kind of a microcosm of Cain and Abel. I'm happy to take this on the authority of Matthieu, like no problem with that. But I'm not sure I would come up with that in any way because, for example, it says that Seth is given in place of Abel. So I would just be like, okay, we're doing this again, but we're gonna have Cain and Seth instead.
Yeah, right. Well, I think actually, I'm going to do something here, just on my own authority, in case this is unclear. I'm going to tie that into this comment. Okay, so here's Gage Murphy saying the fruit of the knowledge of good and bad has to express itself in opposites. No, it doesn't. See my video on navigating patterns on opposites, which is based on your video, sir, with Manuel. No, that's false. And the reason why I mention it now, not only because it came up recently and I didn't have a better opportunity, is to address your question. And that is to say, I'll put this back up. The points of scale, the rules change, like something changes. And then the pattern repeats. In other words, a pattern is not a smooth linear progression from stage A to stage B because scale. And that's why it's a fractal pattern and not a normal pattern, if you will. And people have I understand it. People do not understand this. I totally get that. It took me years to learn this as a computer specialist. When you are building something, there comes a point at which the design that you're using has to change because you have too many things. And so even though you're building the same thing that has the same inputs and the same outputs, the structure in the middle actually has to be completely different, completely, right? And there's different ways to deal with this in computers. There's horizontal versus vertical scaling and all this nonsense. But the real point is that things break at a certain point, and then the scale changed. That's what happened. And so it needs to be reasserted. The pattern needs to be reasserted, or reasserts itself, maybe. I don't know. Doesn't really matter, right? And so that change causes a new starting point for the pattern, even though that's not what's happening. We have to get sloppy with language at some point, right? And so that change is what you're seeing. And so I agree, your limited mind, and that's not meant personally, Gustav. Human beings' limited minds, especially when you're not used to this sort of thing, get caught up in the fracture, in what seems to be an inconsistency or a change or a breaking. But that's actually not what's happening here. What's happening is that is the signal of a new scale, and then the pattern, is effectively reasserted. Does that help? Does that make sense?
I think this idea is really a really fundamental misunderstanding. That's really, if somebody mute, maybe Alina, a lot of noise pollution. I think that this misunderstanding of good and bad is really a core. In order to understand the purpose, identity, or essence of anything, good and bad you can think of as distance algorithms. A chair is a bad car because the purpose of a car is far away from the purpose that is fulfilled by a chair. And the same thing is said of a body. And this is definitely not discerned through opposites. And so in the same way, for example, when you talk about other aspects that are necessary to define something, you have things like the strange, which is something like the limit of being or the limit of influence. And so as you introduce more, so the serpents, for example, would be an example of the strange. So as you introduce more of these aspects, when we get into these diagrams, it's important to understand some of these fundamentals. But yeah, good and bad are definitely not opposites.
And just before Elena talks, because I want to give her some space. Obviously, something to say. I like the example, Danny, but the example that I think people miss is that everything that isn't a car is a bad car. There's lots of bad cars. There's only one good car. That's the problem, right? And that gets tricky if you don't understand Platonic forms, but also you need to understand Platonic forms, right? Everything that isn't the thing is a bad thing, but there's only one good thing. They're not opposites because there isn't a correspondence at all. That's why they're not opposites. The world is not a binary place.
Mark, my question to your statement just now, I don't know if this is the right question for me to try to understand what you're saying is, but this is the one I came up with. When scale changes, does your position, whether vertically or horizontally, change, or must it?
I mean, it depends if you're in the thing. So, here's an example. I'll just do a purely personal
Like-
example, right?
Okay.
Let me try to answer it first, and see if you still have questions. So, I worked at a Fortune 500 company many years ago as a full-time employee, which is not the majority of my career at all, mainly because of this particular incident. What happened was they bought another company. Okay. And now it's already a Fortune 500 company. It's not going to become a Fortune 1000 company for various reasons. That wasn't going to happen. Right. But the scale of the company had changed because they took two companies and merged them. Now, in the process of the merging, what happened to my position is I reported to a director. The director reported to a VP. The VP knew my name. The VP knew who I was. I worked with the VP all the time. This wasn't a big deal. I was also in charge of all the vendors, all the outside vendors, the entire company. I worked with Intel and Sun and all these big computer names back in the day. I worked with all of them. When the company merged, my position changed because I was part of the company, right? Nothing changed to the customers. Like nothing. Probably the support went downhill, right? Or maybe the software didn't get out on time or something, or the customers of the other company that we were merging with that we had purchased, they probably had a big impact, right? But those impacts are flat to them. They're horizontal to them. Like, oh, the customer service is a little slow. The software release didn't happen, or maybe happened better. Like, I don't, it could have happened worse, could have happened better for them, right? But for the big company, the one that was healthy enough to buy the smaller remnant company, the only things that changed were internal. The customers didn't really see a significant change, but everybody inside got shuffled around. So, for example, I got put underneath a different director, and I was basically 2 levels below because they somehow made more people in the way between me and the VP. So the VP had 2 more guys underneath him. And then my boss was now underneath him. And I was like, what's going on? This is going in the wrong direction for a career. I've essentially been pushed down the ladder, right? Because the scale of the company changed. And the scale changed as a result of more people, effectively. And also the worst freaking management and the dumbest management decisions you could ever possibly imagine. But that's what happened. Like, the scale changed. And because I was in the system, that affected me. For the customers of the company, they didn't really see much.
Okay, that's fair. But if you contrast that situation with something like, for example, designing system, with designing a software system, you are outside of that. It's something that there's like you have an arena that even when you need to scale something, whether horizontally or vertically, you're still outside of that. So like this outside, are you outside? Okay, I'm gonna keep with you're outside of it because you're the one designing it. That position, I feel like, is the type that is kind of taken when you say that it's not opposition, it's more so collaboration. It's like, sure, but you're still taking this outside perspective. Yeah.
No, but you're not taking an outside perspective because you're inside of it. And that's the thing. Like, the only person that knows if I'm in opposition is me. And it's the only person that can ever know. You can't actually know if I'm in opposition because, and this is where Gage gets confused. Look up the word you set against. So while it is useful to set things against one another to provide contrast, which we need to see like half a dozen videos of navigating patterns, right? If you can't understand that, and fair if you can't, right? You set it against. That's something you do to the world. It's not a property of the world. It's not in the world, right? It's a position that you take relative, right? Or that you put two things in position relative to one another. And that's actually super important, right? Because opposition is a choice that you make with your free will about how to approach the world. And it has nothing to do with the world. Nothing. Right. And
Yes.
yeah, it may be useful to see, but the cooperation is what's important, right? Because that's how we build something bigger than ourselves, stay out of narcissism and solipsism and sophistry. Otherwise, you will go there because you won't have a choice.
So, just jumping in here, I want to stay with the thing about the definitional thing about what opposition is in the English lexicon, the way we're used to it. I want to present the image of a house of cards as almost an intermediary, going back to earlier in the session today. There's to oppose. There's interplay like the two dots in the Tao. There's setting against each other in a way that creates stability, which is, and I'm going to depart for a second as a tangent. Setting against each other to create stability is in a way related to separating things to create stability. So in Genesis 1 through 3, when there is separation, there is stability. When you get into the Noah story, the binding of heaven and earth is maintaining separation through intercommunication, interrelationship. So again, there is a level of interplay with kind of the house of card thing. When moving back to Castle's earlier point, and I'm gonna take a detour through some of the stuff Mark shared, and give a shout out and put my own twist to. There's a way of saying things which the model proves itself. In real life, that's very helpful. In English, that's very helpful. In computer coding, that's helpful, but not in the same exact way. But so to Mark's point, if you've built a model and it's not working, and it's even if it's proving itself, there's something that you're not noticing. And perhaps it's something that may cause someone, if you're walking through things as Elena was, to have to reconsider, am I inside or outside? And if you're reconsidering that, then there's something in the model that needs to they may warrant re-examination. And going through that, if you're engineering something, and your model doesn't work, the problem is not with the world. And using that to get back to, and so we've got the house of cards, we've got your model, and then we've got the diagrams here at the end of the chapter, and the tripartite diagrams, if we could throw those back up briefly.
By the way, in a moment, let's try to wrap the stream up. We can keep talking as
Yep.
always, but yeah.
Yeah, so luckily this is at the end of the chapter, and I think probably a good place to stop for the session. I don't have much more to add after this point today myself. So we have scaling. We have a sense of lineage. So we've got time in a way. But looking at Seth, Noah, and Enoch, and looking at the direction and the coloring, which is different there than the other two, then we can see how Adam, Cain, and Abel have a different kind of relationship than Seth, Noah, and Enoch, and Seth, Noah, and Enoch being that smaller level inside those other two. So this diagram is demonstrating things that dynamically hold across different dimensions and scale, and so can present information and insight in different contexts. And that's, in this sense, you can read this left to right and right to left, but that will be important to notice that when you're moving left to right or right to left, you're in a completely different context. This is my reading, folks. I've never even talked to the Pageaus. So what do I know? What do you guys think?
Could you summarize
mean,
that like in 2 sentences?
Yeah, what he's saying is directionality is an important component of context, and the fact that you can go right to left and left to right highlights or provides contrasts. Another way of saying highlights, by the way, right? To be able to see the difference, right? That makes the diagram more clear, right? It exemplifies the framing by changing the frame, left to right, right to left, changes the frame, right? And allows you to understand the fractal nature of the reality that he's talking about in the diagram, basically, right? Or exemplifying as a result of the diagram, which I think is the right way to say it. And if you're ever confused about inside and outside, think about what RJ's got up on the screen here. In fact, RJ, let me make you. Whoops, hold on, I didn't do that right. Let me make you big. If you're ever confused about this, like this is where the Eastern stuff really helps, right? Like there is no outside. Like that's easy, right? We get caught in this binary thing, this opposition thing. There's no outside. You are inside. The question is, are you cooperating or opposing? Right? If you want a binary, there's a freaking binary. That might be the only binary I can ever find. That's the problem. Like, just cooperate, and you don't have to worry about whether you're outside or inside. You're inside with everybody else, and that's what avoids domicide. The thing that causes domicide is opposition or opponent processing, opponent thinking, right? This binary stuff. And the thing that solves it is basically understanding that there's a quality to the relationship to the things you have around you, and that quality, or maybe qualities, is important. And that's intimacy. That's the intimacy crisis. We don't understand the quality of the relationship we have or the things we're embedded in. That's what causes the domicide and leads to the meaning crisis. How's that for a wrap up, Gustavs?
I think that's a pretty good wrap up. So how about we each take a moment and privately close our eyes and reflect on the conversation. Think about how you feel emotionally, and think about how you judge today's book club. So take a minute.
Yeah, and when you're doing that, look up. That actually matters from cognitive science. Yes, you're supposed to look up and then close your eyes. You don't have to close your eyes, but you have to look up, because that will help you to contemplate, very importantly.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for watching, if you're watching at home. And please leave comments and participate in the live streams, and leave live comments in those as well. And just participate, and see you all next week.